Hi, today we're going to talk about John Dewey, the relational side of philosophy. John Dewey was an American philosopher and educational thinker whose vision for revitalization and reform have been greatly influential in education. He is regarded as one of the most prominent American scholars of the 20th century. We're going to look at the life and works of John Dewey. He was a progressive educator. We're going to talk about that. He was a pragmatist philosopher. His main element in his philosophy was experiential learning and reflective practice. He also had many publications that we'll talk a little bit about. And then we'll talk some about his opposition, and we'll finish up with a quote from John Dewey. So John Dewey lived from 1859 to 1952. He had many historical events that occurred during his life, including the American Civil War when he was very young, World Wars I and II. He lived through the Great Depression and the onset of the Industrial Age. So many things contributed to the life of John Dewey and his philosophical views on education. He was greatly influenced by community and society, which is a tremendous point when we consider the relational side of his philosophy. He was a gifted and self-motivated learner. He finished his PhD through Johns Hopkins University at an early age and then immediately went into higher education to pursue a career as a professor of philosophy, where he truly developed his personal perspectives in that area. He had a strong sense of public service and good works while working to revitalize education in America. And part of that was because of the influence that his family upbringing had on him, and that was a tremendous part that shaped his perspective. He is also known for his pragmatist philosophy of progressive education, experiential learning, experimentation, and his publications. So, to understand the perspective of a progressive educator is helpful to have the definition of the term. Progressive education is a noun, and it's any of various reformist educational philosophies and methodologies since the late 1800s, applied especially to elementary schools, that reject the rote recitation and strict discipline of traditional single classroom teaching, favoring instead more stimulation of the individual pupil as well as group discussion, more informality in the classroom, a broader curriculum, and use of laboratories, gymnasiums, kitchens, etc. in the school. So we wanted to make sure that the children or students actually enjoyed that. Pragmatism is also defined here, and it's a practical approach to problems and affairs. It was an American movement in philosophy founded by C.S. Peirce and William James and marked by the doctrines that the meaning of conceptions is to be sought in their practical bearings, that the function of thought is to guide action, and that truth is preeminently to be tested by the practical consequences of belief. He was very practical in his approach to education and learning with students. The experiential learning and reflective practice are key elements to how Dewey focused on student needs and interest. Learning was not simply based on textbook memorization. Instead, community and society were key elements in Dewey's perspective. Education should be an integral part of society, not separate from it. Dewey believes students learn through experience and reflective thought, especially in a collaborative setting. This would be examples of problem solving and critical thinking skills. And Dewey also created a problem solving scientific method that helped students work through the phases of experimentation. Dewey's methods were highly process-oriented and based on human interaction within the environment. Dewey also published works based on his philosophy and teaching. Some of his works included The Child and the Curriculum, Democracy and Education, How We Think, Human Nature and Conduct, and most of those are self-explanatory, but they also contribute to his perspective still today. Educators can learn from his teaching in these books and publications. So, Democracy of Education is an introduction to educational philosophy, and How We Think goes into further detail about the experimental problem solving. His philosophies and perspectives remain an important element in education, especially in experimental areas and collaborative learning. One recent article expresses how Dewey's experiential learning is relevant in gamification and the growing area of digital learning environments, which are usually conducted in digital communities, much like an online classroom. The opposition refers to Dewey's opposition. He challenged the traditional Western civilization thoughts on education. He did not believe that all truths were absolute and that we had a perfect universe. Instead, Dewey knew outcomes can change based on environmental influences or interactions with other objects or people. Through experimentation, students could train thoughts and develop the hypotheses on their experiments. And we'll finish with a quote from John Dewey: "Give the pupils something to do, not something to learn, and the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking, learning naturally results." And that sort of summarizes Dewey's whole perspective on education. So thank you for spending this time with me and learning more about John Dewey's philosophy and his relational experience in his education philosophy.